question now. I love your question.
3 questions.
Yeah.
Let me try to answer them and not take up too much time with them. So the first question, you're correct on Talking Points memo. What I was generally saying is that there are sites like that are increasingly pulling in revenue, which is true. I can't speak to the profitability of some of those individual sites. I just don't have that information. I do know one in particular that you happen to mention is extraordinarily profitable. It's not doing the sort of hard-hitting journalism that Josh Marshall is, but PerezHilton.com probably pulls in more revenue than everyone in this room combined. Fair enough. No, I mean, I think I would probably classify him as a version of the newspaper gossip columnist, or in that category. But yeah, it's a very different form, but it is an example of one product like that. To take a stab at the second question, I'm going to try to remember all these. I apologize if I don't. I think we're talking about what he's trying to do is do something across the web and address the fact that sites for the newspapers like your papers are basically right now, I don't believe any of yours are charging, right? Are basically putting that information up for free and try to figure out a micropayment model for that. There hasn't been a large number of examples of micropayments on the web that have been successful, and I think there's a lot of questions, as you raise, about that, and I'm personally one of those who's skeptical that will be successful. I think mobile is a totally different space because people are used to paying in micropayments for things like that. People pay 5 to 20 cents every time they send a text message, which is actually extraordinarily expensive if you ask me. And people are paying money for applications on the iPhone, and there's tons of examples overseas as well of people paying in small bits and pieces over their cell phones and using it to even buy things in stores and examples like that. So that's where I think there may be some potential, because the cell phone actually is not just a communication device. It's a communication device where you can communicate with others, where others can communicate with you, but people also use it as a transactional device as well. And so that's where I think they're two very different things, and that's where I think it's an interesting model. It's so simple. It's easier than a credit card, in fact, to just press a button in here and before you know it, you're paying for something. So I think that's where there's a difference, and there's an opportunity in cell phones. And not just cell phones, but wireless devices as they evolve. That isn't there with the web as well, because as Jane pointed out, on the web we've trained people to expect that information is free. And changing that model is going to be, I believe, a bit of an uphill battle. It would be as though we were to go to folks right now because of the economy and say, ABC, CBS, and NBC, all of a sudden we're going to charge you $5 every time you want to watch one of our evening news programs, and obviously that wouldn't work. So I think that's what we're talking about with the web, whereas with cell phones it's a bit of a new model, and so there's an opportunity to turn it into something different. The last question with diversity, I've worked at a couple of different online organizations, and without giving too many specific hard numbers, my impression has been in the various places I've worked that the diversity numbers in the online space has roughly correlated to other newsrooms that I've worked in or worked with on newspapers in the broadcast side. So I don't think that there's I haven't seen any indication of a serious difference in that regard. I also haven't seen any, indication of it being significantly better than it is in traditional newsrooms. So I think it's similar in those issues, and I think and this might be something that you can actually speak to. My impression is that that some of the ethnic press has actually been doing quite well on the internet, and I don't have firsthand experience with that, but that might there might be some. I mean, I don't know if that's something that you can add on to.
Well, but yeah, I think the issue of diversity is more about hiring, which is different, I think, than the content. And obviously, we have a diversity. We have a 99% Latino staff at El Diario and throughout the company. So, I mean, I think it's different. I think your question is more about the hiring practices and the internet companies actually reporting back on that in the same way that our organizations kind of report back on hiring practices. Is that where your question was headed?
No, that was sort of my point. It's the same issues that we're confronting in broadcasting newspapers. What I can't speak to, which I think is actually quite pertinent, because I think those are issues that I think we're all aware of and we're conscious of, and we're doing what we can to address. But I think the more interesting potential area is, as we talk about these nonprofit organizations and we talk about all these independent outfits that are cropping up in some of these new forms of journalism, which I believe, and I think some of the other panelists concur, are going to be some of the ways that journalism continues in the future. And it's not just going to be, the big media organizations that are responsible for that. How does that affect those areas? Because those are not areas that we're looking at in the same regard at this point in time, and I think those are ones that are something that we should be thinking about.
Jay, if I can just add on this issue of diversity, because we haven't really talked about it. I think, to the members of the NAHJ board who are here, I would definitely urge that one of the main jobs that this association should do is to have a census. We need a census of the online world. There is no census of the online world, so that we actually see what is happening. I don't think the online world is replicating the current state of the media. I think the online world, this is my gut empirical observation, is replicating an even wider situation that decades before in the media. But we don't know. We haven't seen a census. So a census has to be conducted. The other issue is ownership. And it's ownership. What kind of minority ownership exists on these in online news sites? And I think that what the NAHJ and Unity and the other organizations need to do is they need to convene a summit of the Googles of the world and of the other major forces in the online world. What are you doing to promote, and also the investor community, the private equity funds that give the money to people to do their startups? What are the private investment communities doing to make sure that they invest not only in white startups, but in Black and Latino and Asian and Native American-owned startups in the online world? They've got to be held accountable for how they invest their money in ownership, and as well as what kind of a census is done of the employment of these things. Those are two badly needed things if we're going to see what these organizations are going to do to affect hiring in the future.
Also, female as well as male. I think a lot of the new media really does look worse in terms of being very white and very male. I mean, I was just at this conference at MIT with a remarkable array of these new organizations and a lot of high-tech expertise, and it was really white and really male.
Wrap it up in a moment. I know we had one more question, and why don't we have your question and have everybody do final statements?
Actually, I'll just to build on one other point that Geneva was mentioning. When I mentioned the smaller organizations that are out there that are, as I mentioned, at organizations like mine, we have the problems in traditional media are mirrored when it comes from a diversity standpoint. I think the bigger issue is a lot of these independent organizations that are out there, and one of the things that I think is worth noting is that a significant portion of them are either nonprofit or funded by foundations. And so there is an opportunity there, to reach out to those organizations, many of which do have diversity as a priority already, but to make sure that they're ensuring when they issue these grants that they're doing so from that perspective. And I think that is one way to help shape a lot of these smaller outfits that are cropping up.
I have been informed, as much as this conversation is fascinating and I wish it could continue, we have run out of time. I want to thank my incredible panel. Let's give them an amazing round of applause.